listening to Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast with your hosts, John and Darin.
Welcome to Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast. For today's episode, we will be discussing Black Sabbath's first self-titled album. Released on February 13, 1970, Black Sabbath would lay the foundation for the Black Sabbath sound as well as help create the genre of heavy metal. We will look back on when we first discovered this milestone album and our early first impressions, along with a track-by-track analysis. We will also examine its place in the Black Sabbath catalog, as well as its influence and legacy in heavy metal history. I'm your host, John, along with my co-host, Darin. So cue the rain, the thunder, and the tolling bell, and let's get started. All right, Darin. So, When did you first discover the first Black Sabbath album?
Well, it was a little ways into my discovery of Black Sabbath. It was, I think, I'm going to say the third or fourth. I know the first one I had was Never Say Die, and we talked about that before. Second one was Paranoid, and that was the album that really made me a Black Sabbath fan. And if memory serves, the album that followed that for me was Master of Reality, which I loved just as much as Paranoid. It was a really good follow-up to Paranoid for me. And if memory serves, the one after that was the self-titled album, and I was taken back by it initially. The vocals right away threw me off. Did not sound like Ozzy. In fact, I even looked at the back of the album cover to make sure that there wasn't somebody else singing. I knew that Ozzy was in the credits, but I wasn't sure when Black Sabbath, the self-titled song came on, it just sounded so different. So I was put off by that initially. And then as things went on, the same vocal pattern emerged until we got to NIB. And then NIB had more of a familiar sound. I like the riff a lot. Of course, it's similar to Sunshine of Your Love by Cream. So it wasn't anything that was it took me by surprise. It was a familiar, comfortable riff, more straightforward song, less bluesy. I gravitated to that. And then from that song, worked my way out. But, I think initially it was definitely the vocals that kind of threw me for a loop. Also, the title track starting out the album, for me at the time, was a little bit boring. I hate to say it because I love the song so much, and it's such an iconic song. But at the time, I guess I just wasn't really, I really had no idea of what this album sounded like. It was just another Black Sabbath album that I didn't have, that I needed to get. So I didn't go into it very prepared. And prior to this album, the songs that I had heard, a little bit more, more riff oriented, had a better flow. Well, I wouldn't say better flow, but had a different flow. Things would move along from song to song on the album. This one, when the title track came in, it was just dense, and it just dropped like a lead weight. And with the sound effects and the tolling bell, it took me back. That coupled with the vocals, but it didn't take long to wrap my head around it and to really like it. It was a scary song, but I think initially what I was a little bit hesitant about really embracing it was the tempo. It took a while before things really kicked in, and of course when it gets to that middle part and things get, it's almost like a film in a way. You have the beginning of the movie, and it gets to the it goes through the plot line, and then there's the climax, and then the finale. So, and interestingly enough, the way that Black Sabbath came about, of course, as you know, not to jump too far ahead of things, but the horror movie aspect, that was sort of their intention, as far as the image, the name, definitely hit home on this one, especially the title track, because it was like a soundtrack to a horror film. So those are my first impressions.
Yeah, cool. Mine's similar to yours. I had discovered this album. I know I already had Paranoid. That was my first Black Sabbath album. And I'm pretty sure, I know I had Blizzard of Oz. I'm pretty sure I had Diary of a Madman. So my first impressions were similar to yours, where, well, first of all, when I saw the album cover, I've always loved that album cover. It just set the mood for the creepy horror vibe that the album would have for me. And my impression was similar to yours when I turned it on. When I first heard Ozzy's voice, I was like, wow, okay, is this Ozzy, or this is really different? So I was taken a little bit aback by that, but I fell in love with it right from the beginning. The whole sound effects with the rain and the tolling bell, and that when that first riff kicks in. And I remember also being taken aback a little bit, but in a good way, by the mix. The mix has a really open, reverby sound it's very, a lot of high end. You can hear everything, the cymbals, and the way Black Sabbath starts with the song Black Sabbath, with the drums, and the toms on the drums are really echoey and sort of creepy. And then, like you said, it kicks in with the fast riff at the end, and I just loved it. It was as a 11, 12-year-old Catholic school raised kid, hearing these kind of lyrics and this sort of creepy atmospheric vibe. I'd never heard anything like that, because although I don't think there's anything as atmospheric as that on Paranoid or on Diary of a Madman, or maybe the song Diary of a Madman gave me that same reaction, that same sort of creepy, scared, if you will, reaction.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever been anything quite as effectively scary as the first Black Sabbath album. And it's not just the title track; it's all through the album. There is an atmosphere, and I don't think I really honed in on some of the things that you mentioned, cymbal tones or the mix per se. It was still pretty green to a lot of those. I wasn't listening through very critical ears at the time. All music kind of sounded the same. You either heard it. For me, I could either hear things or I couldn't. I didn't grade things based on what a mix was. I didn't even know what a mix was. But how things met my ear was noticeable. And of course, one of the things that was noticeable about this album was the atmosphere, the density of it. The density of the first song was right off the bat. That was very noticeable. But moving along and moving through it from song to song, I mean, it was still pretty consistent. There was a consistent density to it and atmosphere, which has, even at that time, had kind of a dated sound to it, but all the more cool because it gave it its own sort of feel, its own vibe. I can't say that I heard anything that was quite similar to the first Black Sabbath album. So everything about it was completely unique to this album and my listening experience of it.
Yeah, it had a very open, to me, I just remember thinking it had a very sparse and open sound to it. I had already heard Heaven and Hell, and I had Mob Rules. And the other things that I was listening to at that time, like British Steel and stuff like that, it just had a much more open sound, and it always made me think that they were, even though we know now that's not the case, it sounded like it was recorded in a church or something. It has this sort of open, cavernous sound, and I come back to the sound of the toms in the song Black Sabbath, or when Iommi does his unaccompanied guitar parts in Warning and stuff. It sounds like he's sort of in this, there's a little bit of an echo or a reverb or something to it. And even though it's a pretty sparse recording in the sense that there's, for the most part, one guitar, one bass. There would be some spots where the guitar is doubled, but for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward. And as everybody knows, with the story, it was basically recorded live. It's basically a live album with a couple of overdubs, here and there. But it has a big, huge sound to it. And as a young person who hadn't really heard that much hard rock and heavy metal at that point, it just stood out to me as being different, and it added for me to the whole scary vibe of the album. I had Paranoid, I had Heaven and Hell, and Paranoid had moments on it that were kind of creepy. But it wasn't the same as the song Black Sabbath.
No.
NIB I felt was kind of scary because, again, as a young Catholic school lad, hearing somebody sing about Satan like that seemed like crazy. And, I mean, we're going to get into this later when we do a track-by-track analysis, but even a song like Sleeping Village, it seems so strange to me. And again, that sort of echoey, reverby vibe to it, it just felt so strange, and Wicked World was so ponderous and dark sounding, and Ozzy's voice on top of it has that lower emotional, I don't want to say whiny, but he has this just emotive voice on that first record, like in the song Black Sabbath when he does it, God, please, God help me. I mean, as an 11-year-old kid, I was just like, whoa. Yeah, the album cover, just the sound, just the whole package played into it for me. Whereas I don't think when I looked at Paranoid, that album cover didn't feel like anything with the album for me. It was a disconnect between the album cover
I agree.
and the album. Whereas with Black Sabbath, the whole package, the song titles, the album cover, the mix, the tone of Ozzy's voice, the sound effects, the sparseness of some of the songs, the weird little interludes, it just all added up to a real interesting feeling for me.
Yeah, I think one of the things that helps this album be the album that it is, be the iconic heavy blues, rock, metal, proto-doom metal album that it is the way that, the songs all kind of flow into one another. And we had mentioned this before in our Judas Priest thing, right? I talked about the producer Roger Bain. Roger Bain also did the first 3 Black Sabbath albums, and I think I read somewhere that basically he just more or less, according to the band, according to Bill Ward, Bill Ward said that it became apparent after the 3rd album that they didn't really need him, that Tony felt felt pretty confident that he could move forward producing the band's albums, but for the record label, especially for the band on their first album, they had to go in with a producer, and I think Tom Allen. Am I right?
Yeah.
I think
Tom
he was
Allen
also involved in it.
Yeah, he was involved as an engineer, I believe.
Yeah, right. So they, I guess Tony Iommi felt after the 3rd album that he could go move forward on his own and take the band through their own, production. But I think Roger Bain really shaped these albums, and I think there is a continuity in atmosphere between the first and the 3rd. I mean, I can definitely. I think Volume 4 was the first one where there was a different production quality.
Yeah.
But I think the first 3 are really similar. But on this album, that atmospheric, heavy, dense vibe was really established, and the way that the songs just kind of go from one to the next. There's a stop between Black Sabbath and Warning, but Wasp, Behind the Walls, Sleep, basically NIB, all flow into one. Likewise on side 2, you have a bit of Fingers, Sleeping Village, Warning, all one song, very jammy. And I guess the story goes that they basically treated the album recording session as a live show. They went and they just basically did their set. They did their live set.
It feels like that. It feels like you just said, like there is a flow to it, that they thought this out, that it wasn't a case of they put these songs together and then they had to figure out what order they were going to put them in. They just came in and they just sort of played them live. Although, to go back to your point about the album production, for me, this album sticks out differently than anything else in their catalog. For me, it sounds more different. The difference between Black Sabbath and Paranoid is more for me than the difference between Paranoid and Master of Reality. To me, Master of Reality and Paranoid have a little bit of a similar vibe, but there's just something, I keep coming back to this reverb and echoey and the bright cymbal sound on the first record that seemed to just be different to me, that they never. Paranoid to me is a little drier sounding. Same thing with Master of Reality. If you listen to the drums on Paranoid and Master of Reality, they feel more dry to me, whereas on the first album they just have this big sort of echoey sound, like in The Wizard, for instance. All the cymbals are ringing out, and just the drums in general just sound, they don't sound like they're close mic'd. They sound like maybe there was just a room, just a couple microphones approximately placed around the drums, and it really just picked up on the room sound. And maybe, I never thought of this before right at this very moment, but is it my favorite Bill Ward drum sound? It might be. It might be for me, the first album.
Yeah, I think I'd lean more towards Paranoid for Bill Ward's drums, or Volume 4. But you're right. There is more of a reverb sound on the drums. The drums aren't quite as loud in the mix, I think. I think the guitar and bass really dominate this album in a good way. And what's interesting, I guess, is that I think Iommi's intention was to record the album with his
Stratocaster, yeah.
And I think the only song he actually recorded with a Strat was Wicked World. But it didn't work out.
And you can hear it a little bit if you listen to that song. You can hear, especially in the unaccompanied guitar solo spot, you can hear it has sort of a Ritchie Blackmore, Jimi Hendrix clean stratty kind of sound. Another interesting note, and a myth that I would like to dispel, that gets mentioned all the time. I even read it on Wikipedia right before we started this. I opened up Wikipedia just to get my brain juices flowing on this. And everyone always says, which is true, that Tony Iommi did lose his fingertips in the accident. And they said because he lost his fingertips, he tuned the guitar down. On the first Black Sabbath album and Paranoid, the guitar is not tuned down. They did not tune the guitar down until Master of Reality. And then the next 3 records, Master of Reality, Volume 4, and Sabotage, would be Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, sorry, would be tuned down. But for the first album, they're not tuned down. And not only are they not tuned down, I think where the confusion is that he did use lighter gauge strings. He changed the strings on his guitar to make them easier for him to press down. But they are not tuned down. And another little interesting guitar trivia out there, the song Black Sabbath, typically heavy metal songs are in, for people who aren't guitar players, E, which is the lowest string on the guitar. So you can get the lowest sound on your guitar. The song Black Sabbath is in G, which is a higher pitched than E. So the song Black Sabbath, one of their creepiest, doomiest sounding songs, not only is it not tuned down, it's not even in the key of E. So it just goes to show you that you don't need to be tuned super, super low to sound creepy or atmospheric or doomy. And the song Black Sabbath is proof of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the production has a lot to do with how this album comes across too. It's like we talked about, the some of the tones, the atmosphere in the studio. I think that's one of the things, other than guitar tuning. But I think the production is what really makes this album
Absolutely.
what it is, and carry the atmosphere that it does.
So where does this rank for you in the Black Sabbath catalog?
Some days it's number one, actually. With Black Sabbath, they're all interchangeable. They're all like my children. I love them all. Uh, I'm gonna say, like, more recently, probably number three. Right now, my favorite is Volume 4, probably followed by Technical Ecstasy, and then probably this one. I tell you, it was a real breakthrough for me with this album, was getting the original Vertigo UK first pressing, and the sonic clarity between that and the Warner Brothers version really lifted it up to a higher level for me, and I really could wrap my head around it. And listening to the Vertigo, the UK Vertigo, it really sounds like you're in the room with the band while they're recording. This Warner Brothers version has kind of a more muddier. I hate to use the word muddy because it's not a bad sounding record, but by comparison, it has kind of a muddy, almost muddled tone, which I was used to. That's the first way that I heard the album. But when I got the UK version, I listened to it. It just opened it up completely. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Interesting. And isn't the UK version, for people out there who may not be aware of this, the UK version swapped out the song Wicked World and put Evil Woman, which was a cover by a band named, is it Crow?
Crow.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we had the US version because, well, first of all, I love the song Wicked World. And honestly, I think even though the song Warning is a cover, the song Warning, a cover of a song by, for those who may not know, by the Ainsley Dunbar Project.
Retaliation.
Right. Is a way more fitting cover, and it fits the mood of the album because it has kind of a bluesy, doomy riff, if you will. Wicked World, I love that song. So to take Wicked World out and put Evil Woman, which is another cover, and a cover that, in my opinion, it would have really affected the flow of the record for me. Evil Woman is too upbeat, if you will. It wouldn't have worked.
I guess it would. I guess it created some levity overall to the the context of the album. But you're right. I think Wicked World works much better. It's more consistent with the other material on the album, and on side two, it has a nice natural flow from Wicked World through Warning. In fact, I was waiting for you to mention that Warning was a cover. Of course, but I wasn't sure. But what's unusual about a band doing a cover on their first album, you would think that the first album there'd be such a surplus of material because you have all this time prior to that first album to compile material to record. It's kind of strange that there's two cover songs on the first album, but I guess bands at that time were doing it. Deep Purple, they did a couple covers of Hey Joe, and
it was a pretty common thing back then. And interesting. Well, 2 points. I wanted to go back to Evil Woman for a second. If I'm correct, Evil Woman was recorded as a single or as a separate thing before these recording sessions for the first album, right?
Yeah, it sounds, and it also sounds a little bit.
It sounds out of play. That's the other reason why I would not have liked having that as in the version of the record that I had, because sonically it doesn't sound the same as everything else. And the other point I wanted to bring up is I'm currently reading a book by Martin Popoff called Who Invented Heavy Metal? And it's done in a timeline type of format, a month by month, year by year thing leading up to what he considers, and what I agree with him, is sort of the birthplace of heavy metal, which is 1970. And of course, the album Black Sabbath, along with Deep Purple and Rock and the first Uriah Heep album. But I was struck by, in the timeline, they mention when Black Sabbath changed their name from Earth to Black Sabbath. And there's some quotes in there from like their early manager, Jim Simpson, and some other people that were around the band about when they started playing some of these songs like Black Sabbath and NIB. And it wasn't as far in front of the recording of this album as I had sort of originally thought in my mind. I was thinking that they had been playing these songs for a good year or more. But from this timeline that they lay out, and of course it's not like anybody had a diary or something from back then, just pulling this all from people's memories. They didn't have these songs. It wasn't really that long before the recording session. So in a way, I could kind of see how they were kicking it around as a blues band for so many years. They decide to change. They write the song Black Sabbath. They realize they're onto something. And then the direction of the band changes. And then they're ready to go into the studio, and they haven't quite worked up a full album's worth of material. So they reach back into something that they had done in their live sets, a blues number that survived from their original days as a blues band. So that might have been part of it too. It's just that they just flat out didn't quite have enough of their own original material at that point to pull off an entire album.
Well, in 1969, they were playing under the name Black Sabbath. This album came out, I think, February 13th.
February 17th, I think, 13th. Yeah, Friday the 13th. Yeah, it was Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th,
so,
1970. And so, I mean, we're pretty early into 1970. So, a lot of the gigs and a lot of the material was starting to take shape in the second part of 1969. And of course, the Dumfries show, which I think was in October, that was like the holy grail of Black Sabbath live recordings. I think it was one of
for the longest time. When that surfaced on the internet, people were going crazy.
Yeah.
And what was the set list on that? They play Black Sabbath, right?
I have it. I have a bootleg vinyl. They do memory serves. They do Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, I think, comes in cut off. They're even on the master, and there's a whole story behind it. But for whatever reason, the master was, I think it comes in like maybe half into Black Sabbath, and then Warning, Sleeping Village. It was a relatively short set. I think it's like 30 minutes long. But,
and a couple blues numbers. And isn't Song for Jim on there too?
No,
that's another bootleg there's another bootleg floating around with that
was a demo. It was a demo that they did at some point earlier. I don't think that was actually Black Sabbath. I think that was I think it was Earth when they were still
maybe
under the name Earth. So that wasn't really, Earth to Black Sabbath, I guess it's sort of, just a technicality. But the Dumfries one of the first known live, if not the first known, the first Black Sabbath show that was very elusive there for a while.
For me, this album, as far as where I rank it, I'm similar to you in that you talk to me on certain days, and I'll tell you that it's my number one. The only criticism I would lay against this record is, would I have preferred another original song in place of some of the extended guitar solo jamming? Maybe on certain days, I feel like that. Like if there could have been another original song in here, it might have fleshed out the album a little bit more. It feels like with the cover song and the extended guitar solo stuff that again, maybe going back to what I mentioned earlier, they didn't quite have enough material, so they were just sort of doing what they did live, which was to extend some of the songs out to eat up some time. It's still super cool, and I remember the first time I heard it, I just thought it was great. And
Yeah, I don't think there's anything I'd change about it. I think the way that it goes from the very first song from Black Sabbath to Warning, I think is perfect. I couldn't imagine hearing it any other way. The UK version with Evil Woman kind of is a little strange when you get to side two, especially if your first experience with the album is hearing it with Wicked World. Going from that to Evil Woman, it's a little strange. But otherwise, no, I mean, I think even the jamming and the musical interludes, I mean, it really builds the atmosphere, and it just a lot of peaks and valleys, and I think it really just works. It's almost like one long song in a way. It's just it's an album that feels like a composition. And I'm sure there was no thinking about the sequence of this album. It just kind of fell into place. Could be wrong.
yeah, and after all these years, I couldn't hear it any different after all these years. That's why it would be extremely disorientating to me to hear Evil Woman put in place. I've heard this album so many times that I hear what's coming next. It's like you said, it's like a movie. It would be like taking a movie and chopping out 7 minutes of the movie and inserting something else. It just wouldn't work. But
I'll tell you how it does work with Evil Woman is I think there was one of the Universal, and I have so many different CD versions of this too. On one CD version I had, I'm pretty sure that it follows the US version song order and then puts Evil Woman at the very end after Warning. And that makes sense because it does sound like a bonus track.
Yeah.
So, in that regard, it's cool. In the middle of the album, though, from start to finish on a CD format, it's like a commercial interlude, a commercial break.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and yeah, I agree. And the first time, I forget what CD version that was that I got, where it was tagged on to the end of it. That's what I thought, that it was just a single or something that was just added here as a bonus track. And I was surprised when I read later on that it was that. The first time people in the UK heard Wicked World was on the We Sold Our Souls for Rock and Roll compilation. So what do you think about this album's place in the history of heavy metal in general and its impact and legacy? A lot of people say that this is the first heavy metal album.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that even when it came out, I think it was influencing bands. A lot of their contemporaries were. Well, I mean, I think they were discovered by Alvin Lee 10 years after, who saw something in the band that was unique. I don't think they sound anything like 10 years after, but I think he saw them and appreciated that they were onto something different, that it was a new sound, that it was something that was exciting. And I don't think he was the only one that made that assessment. I think they were also influencing some of their contemporaries too. I know over in the United States, I mean, a band like Bang, I mean, they're almost sort of like to me, even though they weren't on quite the level as BOC, Blue Oyster Cult, who were conceived to be the American version of Black Sabbath, to me, Bang were more the American version of Black Sabbath. The lyrics were very dour. The vocals were high pitched like Ozzy.
Yeah.
And they were kind of, and they were influenced by Black Sabbath. So I mean, I think even at the time in the early 70s, I think that they were influential. I think they were turning heads and getting people to go back to the drawing board and say, hey man, let's think this thing through again. I just heard this band and they're incredible, and like I want to do something like that.
Yeah.
As time went on,
go ahead.
Yeah, as time went on, I think it was ever present in mostly heavy metal. I think because of just the sinister sound. I don't think there's any other genre that was more inviting to the sinister sound, the big guitar tone. There was no other genre I think that was inviting to this album as much as heavy metal as it became known, as it became a genre. Recognized this album and built from this album. So as Black Sabbath is one of the first heavy metal bands, I would have to say, yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty much a no-brainer. I mean, other people talk about bands like Blue Cheer and some Grand Funk, but man, Black Sabbath was just, they were heavy. It was heavy.
Yeah, and the difference for me between where I agree with you, I would say that this is the first heavy metal album. And the difference for me between Black Sabbath and Blue Cheer, or let's even just, a lot of people say, I mentioned this earlier, that 1970 was the birthplace of heavy metal with the first Black Sabbath album, Deep Purple in Rock, and Uriah Heep, very heavy, very humble. Mm-hmm. And for me, the difference between Black Sabbath and those other two albums is the dark, like you mentioned, sinister sound, the dark overtones, the entire package, the album cover, the song lyrics, the minor key, dark sounding riffs. Uriah Heep maybe had a little of that on their first album. Deep Purple, there's heavy elements in rock, but I don't think it has anything that's as dark and sinister sounding. Maybe Child in Time, but
you're forgetting about Mark One, Deep Purple Mark One as well. I mean, we're picking up from. I mean, the first two, Shades of Deep Purple and then Deep Purple, I think were more chronologically in time with this. Maybe In Rock came out after Black Sabbath?
No, came out in 1970.
Okay.
Yeah, those three albums, the Uriah Heep and the Deep Purple in Rock, came out in 1970. So that's why a lot of times people say 1970 is the year and the three albums that helped define heavy metal, which I can understand that because I think Deep Purple represents a certain part of will go on to influence a certain part of the heavy metal sound, whereas I think Black Sabbath influenced it with the darkness, the sinister sounds, a lot of the minor key riffing and everything like that. And I would put Uriah Heep somewhere in between Deep Purple and Black Sabbath as far as.
Well, a couple of things that set Deep Purple and Uriah Heep apart from Black Sabbath was they had very prominent keyboards.
Yeah.
Organ. I mean, that pretty much, partly defined their sound. Black Sabbath had no organs. It was all guitar driven. So it stood apart from Deep Purple.
But they did have a mouth harp.
Blues harp, right? It was a Sleeping Village, yeah.
Just think, if history had gone a little differently, the mouth harp could have been the sound of heavy metal.
Yeah, how about that? So they did have that, and that was unusual. But it again, I mean, it fit in perfectly, and I couldn't imagine hearing the Sleeping Village without the mouth harp. But Uriah Heep and Deep Purple, I think at that time had a lot of Deep Purple especially was more of a little bit of an R&B, more rock and roll. They had some, the Child in Time on In Rock was pretty epic, pretty emotional. But I think that struck a different chord. There was nothing really particularly sinister. I mean, the heavy tones, the guitar, the warm guitar tone,
virtuosity, and the keyboards and the guitar. But like you said, it didn't have the same dark, sinister vibe that the first Black Sabbath album did.
I think maybe Uriah Heep may have come close. I think if you're going to say, in order of sinister, it would probably be Black Sabbath, then Uriah Heep, and then Deep Purple. We're just singling out those three bands. Gypsy is pretty dark, very heavy. It almost sounds like something that could be a part of the first Black Sabbath album.
And for some people may not know this out there, that the U.S. version of the first Uriah Heep album swaps out the song Lucy Blues with a song called Bird of Prey. And Bird of Prey is a very metal-ish sounding song for 1970, which makes that album a lot heavier. Lucy Blues is, as the title suggests, is just kind of a loose blues jam. So to swap that out and put in Birds of Prey makes, in my opinion, makes the first Uriah Heep album a lot more heavy, a lot more humble, if you will.
It does. I really like Bird of Prey. It was also on to be later. It's kind of weird because
Salisbury, right?
it was on Salisbury. It was a different version. I don't like it as much as the version that was on that became part of the self-titled Uriah Heep album, U.S. version, Mercury. In fact, more often than not, when I want to listen to the first Uriah Heep album, I will reach for the U.S. version for Bird of Prey. I also like the sequence too. Come Away Melinda is one of those songs where, not really too crazy about, but Bird of Prey is a very heavy song, and it kind of evens things out a little bit. And when we're talking about Black Sabbath, Uriah Heep, Deep Purple, the Uriah Heep album that I'm thinking of is the U.S. version of the self-titled because it includes Bird of Prey.
Yeah. And it should also be noted that the first Black Sabbath album reached number 23 on the US charts and number 8 on the UK charts. So it made an impact. It wasn't like a typical trajectory for bands from that era was your first 2 albums didn't really do a whole lot, and it wasn't until you got to your 3rd or 4th album where you really started picking up some traction. But really right out of the gate, for an album like that to hit number 23 in the US and number 8 in the UK, it made an impact. And as you mentioned earlier, it influenced, I think, a lot of bands. You mentioned Bang, and I think a lot of the bands that were just getting started that maybe put out their first albums in 72 or 73, Black Sabbath they were making an impact right from the word go.
Yeah, it was definitely something that I think really blew people's minds. It's interesting. I didn't know that about how well it charted in the U.S. And it's kind of strange that it did without any single, really.
And at that point they hadn't. I don't think they toured the U.S. until after Paranoid was out. So they hadn't toured the U.S. They didn't get any radio airplay. So that's a good question. Like, how did that album do so well over here? It must have maybe just word of mouth, or I don't know. It's just, I guess word of mouth or the music press, even though they claim, and I believe them, that they were slagged off pretty hard in the music press, but maybe in a way it's sort of the any kind of press is good press, and maybe some people read this and saw the album cover, heard the name, and just the entire package. It doesn't take a leap of the imagination. You see the name Black Sabbath, you see that album cover, you flip it over, you see song titles like Wicked World and Sleeping Village and The Wizard, and it's setting up it sets a tone.
There was also a thing going on, predominantly in the UK, I think, where there was a strong interest in the occult and how it manifested itself into rock music. Black Widow was doing, it was much lighter, kind of almost folk rock, but with, satanic occult lyrics. And of course, the story is that the band was rehearsing, or they were in a flat, and they were talking about the name Earth, and Geezer looked across the street and saw a marquee of a movie theater with Black Sabbath was playing. And Black Sabbath, the movie, came out in 1969, I believe, Boris Karloff, and said, hey, people love to be scared. It's a really attractive thing for people. People love to go see horror movies. What if we did that with music? What would happen? Well, change the name to Black Sabbath, and the interest was noticeable. I mean, they became more attractive. People were intrigued by the name. It was dark. The music that accompanied the concept. It almost became a concept. This horror band, even though they seemed like they were pretty lighthearted people. Ozzy was kind of crazy, and in a lot of the pictures they were sort of, some of the early pictures, black and whites, were kind of dark, but it's they got more photo friendly. You could see them sort of like smiling, and it seemed like they weren't so serious as the name Black Sabbath and some of the music on the album would suggest. But I think the thing about it was that it struck a chord in people because I think people love to be scared. They have a fascination with horror and things that scare them. And I think Black Sabbath, the band and the music, kind of hit people on that level. And I think that's one of the reasons why they became so successful. Curiosity. You see this album on a record store shelf with the witch or whatever she is, the mysterious woman on the front with the cool Art Nouveau, very sparse, woodsy album cover. I mean, it looks intriguing.
And that's a good point, because if you think about what was going on in the world at that time, it was post Woodstock. Altamont had happened, so as a lot of people point to Altamont as sort of being the end of the summer of love, the flower power hippie thing. The U.S. was embroiled in the Vietnam War. The rise of people's fascination with the occult. I'm not sure when Anton LaVey shows up on the scene, but if it isn't around that time, it's not too long afterwards. So yeah, and then Black Sabbath is there with this image, with the name, with the sound, and you can understand how it fit into maybe where the mood was of the world at that time, which was maybe a little bit dark.
Yeah, I think it was, and I think it had a lot to do with exactly the points that you just mentioned, the Vietnam War era and things. It was, it was no longer the summer of love. Altamont was the end of the summer of love, and I think the culture, music reflected that. It was a change. Figuratively, it was a change of seasons, and the season was getting darker. And Black Sabbath's music was there as a soundtrack for that. But I think the original question was, where do they fit in with were we still back on where they fit in with heavy metal?
Sure, if we want to put a ribbon on that, yeah.
Yeah, put a ribbon on that. Yeah, yeah, I think they're definitely, I think Black Sabbath would be the first heavy metal band.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that most people wouldn't argue with that. And when this discussion comes up, it's almost always cited as where it started. And when you consider where Black Sabbath went, and it just makes sense to say that, okay, this is where heavy metal got its start. So, all right, shall we go down song by song on the album? So we've got Black Sabbath first, and we kind of talked a lot about this one, but you got any other thoughts on the first song, Black Sabbath?
One thing we didn't touch on earlier, I talked about the atmosphere. We talked about the structure of the song, how it starts out and where it ends. The fast part and to the ending. But I think the lyrics are interesting too. Very. I guess you could call them satanic. Very horror movie-esque. Hammer horror. For those that don't know, Hammer was a film studio in England that came out with it was sort of like the UK equivalent of Universal Studios, but quite a few years later. But Frankenstein, Dracula were all revamped and represented for the UK, and it was a very very popular film studio and movie house. And Black Sabbath, the lyrics sort of accompany that in my mind, and I think it's where we really hit home with the horror aspect of Black Sabbath, the band. And it's pretty much where it kind of ends too, especially on this album, because then we start moving into different territories. We're going into the Wizard, which was a little bit more Tolkien-esque, I guess, and it was a little bit of a different vibe moving from Black Sabbath to the Wizard with the harmonica. Definitely more of a bluesy, heavy blues song.
For sure. And I always like the way, well, for me, the song Black Sabbath, it's just the whole thing is just fantastic. The sound effects at the beginning, Ozzy's voice in this, the "Oh God, please God help me" is just, I mean, scary and sends a shiver up your spine. And I always loved the way the guitar solo is at the end and the way it builds.
Yeah.
And when it ends at da 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 da.
Yep.
And it has that little tag on the end, and then the way that flows into the Wizard, and hearing that for the first time, you just come out of this really creepy, climactic, dramatic building song that starts off with rain, and by the end of it, it's just this big climactic ending, like a movie, like you mentioned earlier, and then that sort of start-stop at the end. And then you've got that bluesy harp come in, and it's like,
it
wow.
kind of like builds up, like off in the distance, and then comes forward, comes closer to your ears.
For sure. And I love the drumming in the Wizard, that sort of funky, the start-stop guitar, da da, ba da ba 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 da da da. The cowbell.
Yeah, I was going to say
that's like every now and then.
I always listen for that fucking cowbell. It's just like random. I couldn't even,
it is. It's just totally.
I love that cowbell. It's just random, one little stray cowbell hit. Yeah, that's awesome.
But
definitely one of Bill Ward's best performances is on the Wizard.
Absolutely, man. And that's what sells that song for me, is that whole groove, the whole verse groove, and the way it. When at the beginning, he does the guitar thing, and then Bill does the crack, boom, boom. That's just great.
What's so cool about that is it really exemplifies how tight they were as a band. And I mean, to record this in 12 hours, I doubt they did that more than once or twice. Probably, I think everything was really done on the first take, But the way that they're so in tune with one another, even the breaks just come in, they end, and they come all together. Everything's in unison and just perfect.
It's obviously a band that had been. They talk about it all the time, how they were playing. They'd have to play 8 sets, 4 nights a week, and you can just hear it in the tightness of their sound. Interesting, just to go back to Black Sabbath for a second, and I was trying to remember if I've heard this or only ever read about it, that there is another verse to this song. Is there a recording of that out there somewhere, or is that just something I read about?
I've never heard that.
Have you've heard those John Peel session versions? Yeah. There isn't an extra verse on that, is there, during the song Black Sabbath?
No, but here's the thing with some of those early recordings. Ozzy wasn't very good at remembering lyrics, and sometimes he would improv things. Like at one time there was different lyrics to War Pigs, and they were called Walpurgis Night, and I think a lot of it was just kind of ad-libbed by Ozzy. So if there is anything that's different about the John Peel sessions as opposed to the studio, it was probably just accidental.
Yeah, I think it has a little bit of an extra. Maybe the ending is a little bit different.
Maybe, but I think it might have just been something that was more of an impromptu type of thing that somebody messed up.
Well, I'm reading here from Wikipedia, and according to Wikipedia, a version of this song from Black Sabbath's first demo. Now, it says first demo exists on the Ozzy Osbourne compilation album, The Ozman Cometh. The song has an extra verse with additional vocals before the bridge. Interesting. And it says it's tuned differently too. It says the guitar and bass are tuned differently.
Yeah, I don't think that's a demo. Is that a demo?
No, it's he lists it on that album as a demo, but it came out later that those were from a John Peel session that they had done. So I'm going to have to go back and listen to that. I knew I had read that or heard that somewhere, but
again, I'm going to say that it was probably one of those things that was a little bit of an improv. It was probably impromptu. Things kind of got maybe shuffled around a little bit in the live situation.
Yeah, but probably.
Who knows?
All right, so we covered the Wizard. Anything else you want to say about the Wizard?
Yeah. I think we pretty much covered that.
All right. Well, next we have Wasp / Behind the Wall of Sleep / basically / NIB, but I guess we can just take Wasp and Behind the Wall of Sleep, which is one confusing aspect of this album. I remember as a young kid not understanding all these extra song titles, which in this case, I guess Wasp is supposed to represent that drum beat that drum beat is at the end right before basically comes. I guess just the intro to what we call Behind the Wall of Sleep. I guess
Yeah.
that's supposed to
Yeah, I guess that's what it is. There's no time signature next to it. So, and Black Sabbath was the first band I ever saw that would do things like that.
Yeah.
Luke's Wall.
Right.
Use the word interpolating. And have like little subsets and little and Master of Reality did that. They had Death Mask, which was
Death Mask, yeah.
end of Children of the Grave, which I think was omitted from
The Conjuring. Wasn't there something else on Master of Reality?
Yeah, I think that one of the pressings, it wasn't necessarily the first pressing, but it was like an alternative pressing, had all these different additional song titles just for little musical passages that were only maybe like 30 seconds or something. And that's sort of the case of Wasp here. It was like more or less just the beginning of the song Behind the Wall of Sleep, that they decided that they would call it something. And it looks like the album's more full when you look at it, like, oh wow,
yeah.
There's all these songs. But
it kind of starts with the same kind of groovy vibe a little bit, following after the Wizard, but then when it drops down into the ba-da-dee-da-da, and I always loved on that song the way Ozzy, I don't think it's an effect. I think he sang it twice, and they just panned it really heavily, and maybe they're slightly out of time with each other. So as a fun little thing, and as a kid, I used to love doing this, where if you just turn on one speaker on your stereo and listen to that, you'll hear it without that effect, which sounds, when you've heard it a million times with the vocals like that, it sounds fun to listen to it with just one voice. But I always thought that effect on his voice is super cool. And
that is really cool. That's definitely part of the song that I look forward to hearing, the way that Ozzy's voice. And it's funny because Ozzy, this is the only album where his voice really sounds like this. It has more of a deeper tone, and it may have been under some pressure because I think they really wanted to have that bluesy sound, and Ozzy's voice is a little thin, a little more in the higher range. So it may have been a conscious decision for him to try to make his voice lower and more bluesy and deeper, and maybe more masculine, for lack of a better word. I remember one of my first impressions was that I thought he sounded like he was drunk. Like slurred, and his voice was so like he was singing while he was drunk. And of course, the Paranoid, his voice sounded almost completely different. It was still, you could tell it was the same person, but it was very different.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but it's Behind the Wall of Sleep. It's just a cool song. I love the groove in it. I love when it kicks into the ba-dum, ba-da-dun, and the bass starts getting really active. And we haven't talked about Geezer really, which maybe can segue us into our next thing. But Geezer's bass just sounds great on this whole record, and the way the record is mixed so simply, where for the most part it's just one guitar and the bass. You can just hear. And they're sort of separated, where the bass is in one channel and the guitar is in another. So another fun experiment for everybody out there. Turn on one side of your stereo, turn it all the way to the left or to the right, and you'll hear either just guitar and drums and some of the vocals, or you'll hear just the bass by itself a lot of times. And Geezer, especially on this one, really starts stretching out and jamming, whereas the two songs before this, he's kind of playing a little bit tighter to the riff. But in this, you get a little bit of that when a guitar solo kicks in here, that thing that Geezer would do, like after this in, say, War Pigs, under the guitar solo in War Pigs, where Geezer is just doing his best Jack Bruce and just going sort of crazy underneath it. And this is what you get in Behind the Wall of Sleep.
Well, what a great bass player Geezer was. He really occupied his own space. He never tried to follow the guitar exactly. In fact, there's very few times when I can really hear him doing the same thing as what Tony's doing. And you're a guitar player. You're probably more perceptive of that than I am. But when I listen to early Black Sabbath, and especially this album, Master of Reality, I really hear Geezer doing his own thing, really elaborating on the rhythm section, and he stands apart. Bill Ward's very solid, but also, with a lot of finesse and a lot of, like a jazz aesthetic that he applies to Black Sabbath's music. And where Tony is, he's his own master of tone, and his solos and just his riffs. Each person has their own value. It's what's so amazing about Black Sabbath, the band, is that everyone seemed to really pull their own weight. Each person was an important component to the whole thing.
For sure.
Especially Geezer. I mean, you could just really pick out. A lot of times for me, I'm not a bass player, and a lot of times the bass does kind of fall into the background. It's not very, very noticeable. With Black Sabbath, Geezer's playing, you could always hear it kind of like bubbling there somewhere in the background, but also very noticeable. I think that's really
absolutely, and you can really hear in that guitar solo section and Behind the Wall Sleep their blues jammy influence, the Cream stretching out. You can imagine them playing this live and going off and just stretching out on it, and then you can really hear that influence in their sound, that little bit of jazzy, bluesy, the way Geezer is playing underneath there with the bends, the way he bends the strings to give it that blues scale sound. So it's just super cool. And then it leads into, I always love the way the song ends. I guess that's still considered part of Behind the Wall Sleep, where it just goes into that do ga do do ga ga ga, and the song fades out, and the drums, Bill's playing sort of that funky do gaga do gaga. There's a part that's I always love. That's my favorite part, is the do gaga do gaga do gaga, and then it fades out, and then the bass comes in. And I remember when I first heard that, I was already playing. Yeah, I would have. Pretty sure I was playing guitar at that point. I'm not 100% sure if I had picked up the bass yet, but I wasn't even 100% sure what that was. The way the bass sort of snakes in there, and he's playing that rubbery bluesy solo thing. It was like, wow. And then it kicks into I know at the time I didn't know when he kicks on the distortion in that wah-wah pedal for the beginning of NIB. I know at the time I had no idea what that was. I was just like, whoa, what is this? But going back to Geezer, what an interesting type of player he was. Here he has his own bass solo, and again, you can picture them playing these songs live, and that bass solo probably would have been a lot longer. That drum solo that Bill does before that was probably something that they would stretch out on, and they tightened it up and brought these aspects of their live show onto this first album.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Just super cool, and just a great signature Geezer Butler moment, that bass solo and the beginning of NIB.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really cool to talk about how this album just sounds almost like a live album. And of course, we know that it was recorded live in the studio with maybe just a couple overdubs. I think the only thing they really overdubbed was, I know Sleeping Village had some overdubs, and I guess probably Warning, because I think there were some doubled leads in that, but everything else was pretty much just like live. So this is almost basically a live album, and I think ideally it serves the purpose of what an album was supposed to do, and I guess fundamentally should still do, is be a representation of what the band sounds like when they play live. And that's where this album was most successful. I'm sure when you saw Black Sabbath at this time live, it probably sounded like you were listening to the album.
Yeah.
Barring a few subtle differences. But I think if you weren't able to see them, which most people everyone in the U.S. probably, unless they traveled, wasn't able to see Black Sabbath, this was the next best thing. Listening to this album, they gave you a pretty good idea of what they sounded like live.
Yeah, for sure. And then NIB, maybe one of the big songs off the album, you would say that had been in their set lists. The song Black Sabbath stuck in their set list for forever after that, and then NIB probably the next long-standing one, maybe the most compact song on the album. The riff, I always loved the riff. The vocal, Ozzy's vocal delivery, especially in the "Your love for me has just," is just great. And this is one of my, if I had to make a top 10 Tony Iommi guitar solos, this would probably be in a top 10 because it's Iommi at his best. It's when he does those melodic down, 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 bam, bam, bam. It has the melodic.
Like he built off the riff.
Yeah, it's like a riff. His guitar solo in itself is of a riff. Another one that immediately pops to mind is the beginning of the guitar solo in War Pigs. Down, 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 down. That in itself is a riff that people sing along to, you know. And the guitar solo just builds really nicely in NIB, and the way it sort of builds up to a big climactic thing, not unlike, I never really thought of this, but not unlike the song Black Sabbath. It just builds really nicely, and just a lot of the way it moves up and down. It's got a slightly groovy feel to it, the drums and the verse and everything, but the way it drops down in those, I guess you would call it the chorus, and then throw in the subject matter again as a young kid and hearing, you know, you get to the end of the song and my name is Lucifer. Yeah.
Yeah,
Great song.
I think everything that needed to be done to establish what Black Sabbath's intention was done on this album. I think if there had never been any other album that followed Black Sabbath, I think that they'd probably still be as legendary just off the strength of this one album.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe NIB, I never really thought of this, but maybe NIB is the song that sounds the most like what was to come after it. Like if you were to take a song from here and put it on Paranoid, maybe NIB might be that song, because it's pretty compact. There isn't any excessive jamming or anything. It's a pretty, I don't know what the time is on the song. I'm guessing it's not much more than 4 minutes, maybe at the most.
Yeah, I would say so. Well,
it's very well written. It's got changes in it. It's got tempo changes. It's got a big Iommi solo. It's got some jammy type bass stuff from Geezer underneath it. So, and in Iommi solo, another thing I'd like to point out, that is this the first time he does this on this record? I think so, where he starts soloing and another guitar comes in soloing at the same time. He did this on War Pigs, and he does it throughout various albums, but that to me is just super cool. There's like these two guitars, and they're not playing the same thing. They're just sort of crossing paths with each other, and when you got the headphones on, it's just really cool.
It's kind of an interesting thing that he's doing that. I never really felt that I could really feel anything from his solos other than, you know, the atmosphere that it was building and the way that it fit in with the context of the song. But to take his solo, and a lot of them were doubled at this point, and I think combined you had one good solo. Individually, I don't know why he chose to do that. Maybe it was lack of confidence in one, committing to one or the other. But as time went on, and as we'll get further into when we go through the discography, by the time he gets to Technical Ecstasy, I think he really hones in on what his strengths are in composing a solo, and I think some of his best solo work is on Technical Ecstasy, which is an often overlooked album. But at this point, you know, I think he's building up and, you know, experimenting a little bit, and I think the overdub 2 solo thing was more or less in the fact that was pretty effective on this album. It builds a lot of takes up a lot of space.
It's a unique thing that I can't really think of anybody else who was doing something like that. I mean, it's just a unique kind of quirky little thing that he did for the first couple Black Sabbath albums that he sort of moved away from. But I think it's just a cool kind of signature thing to his sound.
It's definitely worth noting because it's very, very prevalent in the early stuff.
All right. Well, what do you think of Wicked World?
Wicked World is great bluesy, heavy song. A lot of different movements, a lot of different things going on in the song, but fitting together seamlessly. Pretty ambitious, I think, the way that it all comes together. And of course, if you've ever heard it live in and around this time, it was just like this extravaganza. You know, Iommi goes off on a very long solo, and there's some drum solos and a lot of things, going on in this song. It was pretty much the centerpiece of the live set at a point in time. But as it fits into the album, like we said earlier, I mean, I think it's hard to imagine it, or it's hard to hear it without Wicked World being the first song on side two, coming after NIB. So it's a really cool song. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always loved the hi-hat thing at the beginning. Kind of showing off Bill's jazz influence and the way it starts, the da 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 da, and then it drops down. Another sort of signature Black Sabbath thing being born here. These tempo changes where it starts off kind of, I guess you could say upbeat. It's got that jazzy hi-hat thing going on, da da da, and then it drops down into the bluesy. Yeah. There's certainly you hear their blues influence, but it's clear that they're doing something different with the blues than Cream did, than Deep Purple than anybody else really at that time was doing. There is that blues influence there, but it's definitely they do something to it and take it in a direction that makes it sinister and dark sounding.
Definitely. It was more exciting. It was less predictable. It wasn't predictable, which is one of the things that makes it exciting. You didn't see where that was going to go. First time hearing it, it's like, wow, I didn't think it was going to take that turn, but they did, and they did it. And that was one of the things that was always so cool. And one of their trademarks is that all of a sudden, there'd just be like this, like an electric funeral where they'd go into this happy part, and then get back down to the dark, dirty riff. One of the things that I think they pioneered that whole thing. I'm not sure many bands since then have really done that. At least, maybe some of the doom bands, contemporary doom bands, but it's mostly an homage of Black Sabbath. But yeah, I agree. It starts off jazzy, very light, kind of a boogie type of thing, and you think it's going to go one place and it goes somewhere else. And I'm really glad that it does, because it just sounds so cool.
Yeah, and I'll tie this into the next song. I think what makes the Black Sabbath as heavy as they are, and this sounds like a contradictory statement, is some of their lighter things, because it sets up a contrast. You start off with this upbeat did it thing, and then it drops into this heavy riff. And to move into the next song, it's the same thing in the next song, Sleeping Village. It's sort of, to me, sometimes things like Sleeping Village were the things that really scared me as a kid, because it sounded so murky and weird. And it's just short little, quirky little interlude that sets up, again, it creates this contrast of light and darkness. And going back to Wicked World for a second, the Geezer's lyrics, which set the template for a theme that Geezer would return to often, which is sort of this social justice, destruction of the earth, the environment. Sleeping Village then has just sort of creepy, the mouth harp thing, and the imagery is sort of bright sun rising, and again, it just sort of these contrasts of light and darkness is what, for me, makes Black Sabbath really heavy. If you look ahead to other albums, it would be hearing Fluff, and then it goes in somewhere totally different, or the song changes, and then it goes into something totally different. It was these contrasts that are what really made Black Sabbath heavy, whereas when you get into modern metal, I think way too often people think that they need to be dark and doomy and sludgy all the time, and they don't realize that it was these contrasts of having a song like Sleeping Village, which is one feel to it, and then moving into something that a little bit darker, and it just brings out the darkness more in the other songs.
I think even with Black Sabbath, when they were doing songs that were like changes, there's still a real heavy emotional vibe to it. That,
Yeah.
The album can still be heavy, still have a heavy emotional quality to it without having it represented with the guitar tone.
And Sleeping Village is a good example of that. It sounds kind of creepy. There's really nothing in that song. It's just that mouth harp and the vocals. Yet it has sort of a weird, creepy, strange vibe to it. And like you just said, Black Sabbath could get that emotion across they didn't have to do it with just sludgy, heavy guitars. That's why I pointed out at the beginning of this, and I wanted to point out that they're not tuned down on this album, and the song itself, Black Sabbath, is not even in the key of E. So all you kids out there that think in order to be heavy, your guitar's got to be tuned down to Z, and you got to be super sludgy and stuff. You don't. Black Sabbath sounds creepier and darker than a lot of bands with just a mouth harp and Ozzy singing.
Yeah. Just ingenuity.
Exactly.
Even with Ozzy singing, like soft breeze blowing through the trees, he has like this raspy quality to his voice, which I've never heard after that. It really sounds like an old, and in that particular line that he's singing, he just sounds like a seasoned old bluesman. He's really in that mindset of blues rock vocal performance. And moves away from that pretty quickly. But it's just interesting to note that they all seem to be on the same page, and Ozzy included. And, maybe Geezer wrote the lyrics, but it's Ozzy that sells those lyrics in the way that he sings. I think he's always done that. I think he didn't get as much credit as relatively speaking. I think people like to, say Ozzy was, not very talented, or he didn't really contribute as much as some of the other members. But I think it was Ozzy's voice that really sold Geezer's lyrics and really made the music very effective. And he certainly pulled his weight, I think, as much as anyone else in the band.
For sure.
And I really like the way he sings Sleeping Village.
All right, and we come up to the last song on the album, Warning, which is a cover song, but when I was younger, having bought this on cassette, there was no indication that was a cover song, and to me it didn't stand out as like, whoa, this doesn't sound like Black Sabbath. To me it fit in pretty well it had a little bit of a different feel than the other stuff before it, but it still had kind of a dark feel to it, this guy, the love gone wrong type of thing. The way Ozzy sings it, he sings it a lot like mournful and bluesy, like you mentioned, like a lot of the earlier songs. So to me, I didn't even know it was a cover song till years later, when I don't know how I found out. Maybe when I saw the vinyl version of it and I looked at the credits on the back. But it fit right into the album for me, and the way the guitar drops down and does its own thing there for a little while, I thought was really cool. When I first heard it, getting to hear Iommi stretch out like that, and he plays some little riffy type things in the middle of it, which is there's a little bit of an effect on the guitar too, I think, where one point it sounds like it gets really echoey at one point, and then it sort of comes back in. So yeah, just a cool song, and I guess a cool way to take the album out.
Actually, Ainsley Dunbar isn't credited on the back of the album cover. It isn't. In the first format I had this album on was vinyl, and I was aware. I kind of vaguely knew who Ainsley Dunbar was because I knew he was in Journey, and I think my dad had a couple Frank Zappa albums that I remember seeing. The name rung a bell, and I think it was because he was in the Mothers at one point, I think 70, 71. But I did notice that there was the name Dunbar in Warning, and it stood out from the other credits on the album, which were Iommi, Osborne, Ward, and Butler. And then here on Warning, there's Dunbar. So that was one indication that this was a different kind of a song. But there was nothing that flat out said this is a cover of Ainsley Dunbar's Retaliation. So strange. Maybe they wanted to keep it a secret. But you got production, or you got
you got money off it.
Right.
He's still right. All right. Well, any other thoughts on that particular song or the album in general?
Yeah. I mean, I guess this one of the cool things about this album is that it's so all the first. I think everybody loves to single out the first 6 Black Sabbath albums as if they're the only ones you should listen to, and I don't agree with that. But what I will agree with is that they are essential to heavy rock music and heavy metal or whatever. And each of those 6 albums are distinctly different from one another, and this is where it begins. This album sounds like nothing that came after. And subsequently, any album that comes after this doesn't sound like the one that follows. But this one in particular, I think, it's a great place to start, not only because it's chronological, but also because it really establishes, I think, what Black Sabbath were always known as, and that was a heavy blues rock band. And if this album hadn't been established, hadn't been recorded the way that it was, didn't contain the songs that it did, I think that they wouldn't have the identity that they have to this very day. I think this album was what established Black Sabbath and gave them their identity, even though they moved away from it very gradually. And by, of course, 1978, they were on a completely different planet musically. But, this album is what gave them their identity.
Yeah, and it makes sense in their catalog. And what I mean by that is you can see the progression. You can see where they're going to go from the first album to the second album. As I mentioned earlier, maybe with a song like NIB, you can hear their earlier influences, but it's not a case of like sometimes bands' first couple albums, you mentioned Deep Purple earlier. The first 3 Deep Purple albums are sort of psych rock records. And if you're somebody who's only ever heard Smoke on the Water or My Woman from Tokyo, and then you were to hear one of those early first 3 Deep Purple records, you might be like, is this the same band? Granted, it was a different singer and everything, but you can make that comparison with a lot of other bands. The first 2 UFO records, that was kind of a common thing back then, where your first few records, you mentioned Journey, Ainsley Dunbar and Journey, the first few Journey records are like instrumental fusion albums. So that was common back then for bands to sort of search for their sound on the first couple records. And Black Sabbath, although they still have a little bit of a foot in where they came from as a blues band, you can see that it's pretty well formed, and you can hear the seeds being planted from where the band would go, with the riffing, with the jamming bass underneath the solos, with the subject matter, and like in Black Sabbath or Wicked World. So you can see where the seed was planted. That's a good way I sort of look at it. It's like the seed was planted here. The tree was starting to sprout up. It doesn't stand out to me like, yeah, it does sound a little different. It does sound different than the other albums, but it makes sense to me when I put them all in order. It isn't a situation like the Deep Purple albums or something where it just sounds like it's just a different band. It still sounds like the same band. It just sounds like this is them discovering their sound and coming into themselves.
Yeah. I think this album just got the ball rolling. I think that it was their starting point, and they worked off the momentum of this album, and they just kept on going. For the next four or five albums. I think by 76, things are starting to wind down, getting a little bit probably less than enjoyable for them. But yeah, they're definitely flying high up until and including Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. I think by Sabotage, things were starting to get old. Some business issues, management, things like that. And as we move forward and we talk about Sabotage, it'd be interesting to contrast where they are at that time versus where they started out. But yeah,
Indeed.
Black Sabbath.
All right, Black Sabbath. Well, we would like to thank you for listening today. Please go to our Facebook page. We have a Facebook page, facebook.com/Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast. You can leave comments there. We also post the audio for our episodes on YouTube. We are on Spotify, hopefully soon to be on Apple and all the streaming services. So we would like to thank you for listening, and we will be talking to you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Take care, everybody.